Welcome to No Apologies. I'm Dana Lash. So anybody with two brain cells to rub together knows that the wheels are coming off this bus called the Biden administration. So it turns out it's happening a lot faster than I think anybody pretty much imagined. So remember, President McUnity was going to end the pandemic, and the pandemic is in full swing. President McUnity's vaccine mandates are backfiring. Even BLM is speaking out against them. I mean, you're uniting BLM and a lot of people who are independent and on the right. You did that. Biden was going to also improve the economy, but we got new jobless claims in, and it's bad. We have a labor shortage. We have supply chain disruptions and inflation. We were going to be respected again in the world. Our allies are now angry with us. The French ambassador returning home and Israel's ambassador possibly leaving next. Our NATO allies feel completely disregarded, especially after that disastrous Afghanistan exit in which we left thousands of Americans and allies behind enemy lines. Hundreds are still there. And following right on the heels of the foreign policy disaster still unfolding in Kabul comes another disaster, this one on our southern border. It's ongoing. And once again, it's a disaster of the administration's own creation. So from the moment that President McUnity got into the White House, the word went out, get to the American border while the getting is good, because this administration wasn't going to do anything to stop it. They weren't even going to help fund for additional agents that already needed additional funding, and the Republicans were fighting with Democrats over that already. So desperate people are doing what desperate people do, and they're hightailing it to America. The crazy thing is that all of the illegal entrants, they are not all desperate refugees either. And this is what's very interesting about this narrative. So the left has presented the issue as, especially where it concerns the Haitian migrants, as that last hurricane just blew a bunch of Haitians right across the Gulf and right up into Del Rio, when in reality, reports show that a significant number of those Haitian immigrants actually have Chilean identity cards. So the Daily Mail has independently reported that many of those crossing the Rio already had jobs in Santiago. They were given asylum by Chile. Google it. It's like a big news story from years ago. They had photo ID. In fact, the majority of those coming in, of Haitian refugees coming in, are from Chile. Chile was an upgrade from Haiti, and the U.S. is an upgrade from Chile. So the Center for Immigration Studies reported that the vast majority of Haitian migrants are coming from Chile and Brazil, and most have actually been in those countries for years, anywhere from 5 to 10 years before taking advantage of Biden's open border policy. And over 1 million illegal entrants have come, and 2 million by the end of this fiscal year. There is no way to process this many people humanely or safely. And so you have people pouring across the border. And there were interviews today. In fact, Bill Melugin was talking to some saying that they were unvaccinated. They weren't even asked about their status. And this is during a pandemic. You can lose your job if you don't get vaccinated in some instances, and actually most with this mandate. The Border Patrol tries in vain to intervene to protect America from this overwhelming wave of people whose identities can't always be verified, pouring across the southern border. And when they do, they're called racist by the administration that actually caused the crisis to begin with. They smeared the mounted Border Patrol and accused them of whipping Haitians, and now some of those mounted Border Patrol are suspended from their jobs. Here's Jen Psaki, White House spokesperson, never missing an opportunity to deflect from this administration's disaster. Watch.
We feel those images are horrible and horrific. There is an investigation the president certainly supports, overseen by the Department of Homeland Security, which he has conveyed will happen quickly. I can also convey to you that the secretary also conveyed to civil rights leaders earlier this morning that we would no longer be using horses in Del Rio.
She's really concerned about those racist and evil horses. They were REINS, so they're getting rid of the horses. No, now you have to just chase people down and whoop them on foot. No, they were REINS always. That's insane. But the policy's still there. They're conducting an investigation. They suspend the use of horses at the border, but not the policies that are causing all of this. So there's not going to be any investigation of the Afghanistan debacle. And I should point out, too, that no one lost their job in the Biden administration after 13 U.S. Marines, service members, were killed and thousands of Americans and allies stranded. Now, in any case, Democrats, rather than praise Border Patrol for having to do the job the federal government won't, they use it as another opportunity to malign the United States as a racist country, which I ought to add, the majority of Border Patrol agents are Hispanic, and people who don't realize this have never been to the border or left the Tupperware fresh environment of New York or DC or LA. It's insane. This is Maxine Waters, who's still totally nuts, going off about it. But notice it's not just the Border Patrol that she's claiming about. She's also kind of slamming the Biden administration, which I don't necessarily trust this strategy. I think they're still trying to focus that much on this, and they're having this faux compassion to try to get the Biden administration past the Afghanistan debacle. Watch this.
I'm pissed. I'm unhappy, and I'm not just unhappy with the cowboys who were running down Haitians and using their reins to whip them. I'm happy with the administration. We are following the Trump policy. He is the one that does not follow the Constitution and would not allow those seeking refuge to be able to petition to get into the country. What the hell are we doing here? What we witnessed takes us back hundreds of years. What we witnessed was worse than what we witnessed in slavery.
I can't believe I heard that. You did too. That's nuts. So apparently Maxine Waters is claiming that under former President Trump there was no asylum, when actually it was just the Remain in Mexico policy, which you have to do if you come from any other country. And also, if you try to go to any other country, there's ways to file for asylum that don't include going across the border. And it's weird because she's speaking specifically of Haitian refugees who were already given asylum in Chile. Yeah, she's nuts. So we heard a couple of things here. One, she has no idea how to ride a horse. Two, she has no idea about the makeup of Border Patrol. And three, she thinks overwhelmed Border Patrol is the enemy, and what they did in trying to block people from illegally crossing into the border is worse than all of slavery. Maxine Waters really is not our finest there in D.C., right? So she also directed her ire at the Biden administration. So I'm not going to say she's right because she's mad. She's been in Congress longer than most of us have been alive. She hasn't done anything about illegal immigration or the border or done anything to prevent the cartel from exploiting this the entire time. So Maxine Waters apparently thinks that Haitians should just be able, and not just Haitians, but anyone, come on in. You don't need to show any ID. Stay for forever. Now, with all of the discussion about the former president of the United States, remember the whole kids in cages thing? What do you think that the Biden administration is planning to do? They're actually going to, and this was because of an official job request that went out, they're actually going to be sending them to Gitmo. Yes, the Gitmo terrorist prison facility. There, see? That's detained 780 suspected terrorists since 2002. Biden had promised to close Gitmo while he was campaigning. Now he's sending Haitian refugees to Gitmo. They actually put out a request through the Pentagon, or not Pentagon, but DHS actually, and immigration offices to hire someone that can speak Haitian Creole. There's still 39 suspected terrorists, by the way, at this terrorist prison camp today. The Biden administration, remember, all campaign, they wanted to shut down Gitmo, just like Obama said, wanted to shut down Gitmo, but they never did. So now Biden, the administration, wants to open up Gitmo to house Haitian refugees. So the very compassionate Biden administration is going to send refugees to Gitmo. Now, I have to say, can you imagine if Trump had sent even one illegal entrant to Gitmo? Can you imagine the outcry from the kids in cages to kids sent to a famous terrorist detention camp? Imagine the headline, Trump sends immigrant children to Gitmo. Oh my gosh, that would have been on the New York Times front page above the fold every day for a year. AOC would have flown to Cuba for a photo op, and then she would have been crying right outside another parking lot in her Eat the Rich dress. Remember the kids in the cages policy, that actually began under the Obama administration. A quick sidebar about that. Because the reason that policy was even in effect in the first place is because there were reports of sexual molestation and child sex trafficking with children that were being brought by adults unknown to them across the border. And so one of the things that had to be done was to separate the children from the adults just to verify that they knew each other and that they weren't actually victims, because the children were not going to be talking in front of their either abductors or traffickers if that was the case. You should actually go back. It's all this information is hidden on the internet. because you can see that there was a significant number of children that actually had to be liberated from trafficking because of this. So I actually don't disagree with that policy from the Obama administration. I think it's stupid that they had to have it because they could have ended the policy that was attracting people to come across illegally in the first place. The non-compassionate policy that was putting children's lives in danger. Apparently nobody cared about that, and nobody cared that Trump actually ended that policy. So all you were told was that Trump was putting kids into cages. Now remember the Time magazine cover of evil Trump towering over the small immigrant child crying? Well, Biden is now sending Haitians to Gitmo. Let's just use that progressive logic here. I wonder if Time is going to do a cover of Joe Biden on a horse whipping Haitian children in Gitmo next to a cell with an al-Qaeda terrorist. I mean, I don't know. Now, to be clear, these Haitians supposedly won't be housed near terrorists, but who cares? Optics, right? Let's do what the left does. Isn't that how they present this? But apparently some Haitians will definitely be going to Gitmo because according to that DHS listing, it was posted on September 17th, the immigrant holding facility has the capacity to hold 120 people, and they will have an estimated daily population starting at 20. Now, why is this happening? Because we're having irregular immigration at the border. This is from the administration, whose greatest gift is finding euphemisms that are so awkward and sometimes cringy for words like debacle or crisis or disaster. But I guess that's what happens when you're dealing with one self-induced crisis after a crisis. So here's DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas trying to explain the crisis at the border without using the word crisis. Watch.
We have not seen before such a rapid migration, irregular migration of individuals as we have observed and experienced with respect to the Haitians who've crossed the border in Del Rio, Texas. That has been an unprecedented speed.
Rapid migration, irregular migration. Imagine having to oversee this disaster. It's impossible. So rather than call it a crisis, you make up insane words. Rapid migration sounds like a process. Irregular immigration sounds like a lady issue. See your doctor. So when your immigration is irregular, do you ever have that irregular feeling with migration? You send Haitian refugees to Gitmo. So the Camp for Haitians down in Gitmo apparently is going to host a daily population of about 20 people. They're looking for a service provider apparently. The provider they have to be able to have equipment to house up to 400 migrants should there be a surge, because it sounds like they're predicting a surge. There's a surge now. So you can bet that they're going to be housing a lot more than 20 people. And they also want to make sure that the service provider for Camp Compassion down in Gitmo can speak Spanish and Haitian Creole. Now, this is all a distraction, by the way, because the vast majority of those 12,000 Haitians that are camped under the bridge, they're actually being sent further into the interior of the country. They're being put on buses, some on commercial flights, and they're being sent all over the nation to stay in America permanently. But nobody tells you that. But that's what's happening. And it's one thing that the Biden administration doesn't want or need. They don't need that additional optic on top of the optics of 12,000 Haitians sleeping in huts under a bridge in Del Rio. And because those optics rightly describe this border fiasco as a crisis, it's not regular or irregular immigration. And it's not just Maxine Waters that's actually bashing the administration or the Republican Party, but it's also humanitarian groups. Wendy Young is president of the immigrant advocacy group Kids in Need of Defense. Now, she told NBC, quote, "It's highly concerning that the administration may be considering using Guantanamo to detain Haitian asylum seekers or others," end quote. And now it's also Biden's special envoy to Haiti, Daniel Foote, that just resigned. So when it rains, it pours. He's resigning after only 2 months on the job. Here's what Daniel Foote had to say about his resignation. He wrote to the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and said that he was stepping down immediately, saying, quote, "I will not be associated with the United States' inhumane, counterproductive decision to deport thousands of Haitian refugees and illegal immigrants to Haiti, a country where American officials are confined to secure compounds because of the danger posed by armed gangs to daily life. Our policy approach to Haiti remains deeply flawed, and my policy recommendations have been ignored and dismissed when not edited to project a narrative different from my own," end quote. I will have to say that he's not allowed a narrative. It's the president's narrative. That's usually how it goes. But I wonder how former special envoy to Haiti, Daniel Foote, feels about sending Haitians to Camp Compassion at Gitmo, especially since, as special envoy to Haiti, he's seen all the Haitian people I've been dealing with. And I would have to imagine that he realizes that Chile also had given a number, thousands and thousands and thousands of the same people illegally crossing the border, had already given them asylum. I swear, every earthquakes and hurricanes, I feel bad for Haiti. They have a corrupt government and they keep getting hit by natural disasters. But the Biden administration's own people feel that this border crisis, this isn't a natural catastrophe. It's a man-made one of the administration's own design. Daniel Foote was essentially saying that the Biden administration wasn't even listening to his recommendations. And did you catch that last part too? Foote also says that the administration was editing his policy recommendations, apparently without even checking with him. So the admin is apparently lying. They're changing that envoy, now former envoy's policy recommendations on Haiti rather than communicating what Foote was actually trying to say and recommend. And where's the border czar, by the way? Do you remember the VP? Still staying very, very far away from the border, other than to condemn Border Patrol. Kamala Harris's fake outrage over the Border Patrol using horses to stem the flow of those crossing illegally and trying to direct people away from crossing illegally. Think about the irony of this. The border czar condemning law enforcement for doing their job. But of course, she would do that. As I said, the wheels are coming off this presidency. Jen Psaki can't spin it fast enough, and there aren't enough euphemisms in Webster's dictionary to cover up the ugly truth. We're witnessing the most destructive and disastrous 7 months of any administration in modern history. Everyone knows it, including the people inside the Biden administration, like, the now former special envoy to Haiti, Daniel Foote. Coming up, we deep dive into the AUKUS agreement and China's latest move and warning words, not just against Taiwan, but also now their latest threat to Australia. Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China, joins me next to discuss. How much equity do you have in your home? Cybercrime experts are alerting homeowners that the more equity they have, the greater the chance criminals could target them. Home title theft is one of the fastest growing crimes, and Home Title Lock, America's leader in home title protection, is warning homeowners that they could potentially be victims and not know it. Cyber thieves can search hundreds of public databases for high equity homes, find your home's online title, forge your signature stating you sold your home, and take out loans with your equity. Insurance or common identity theft programs won't cover you. Protect your most valuable asset. Register your address to see if you could potentially be a victim and receive a complete title history of your home, a $100 value for free. Visit HometitleLock.com. So, time to take a deep dive into that AUKUS agreement that's between Australia, UK, and the United States, and China's latest move, not just against Taiwan, but also their new warning language against Australia. Because Australia decided to seek nuclear propulsion submarines. Now China says that, well, other countries could look to use nukes on you because you want to have nuclear capability. Gordon Chang is the author of The Coming Collapse of China, and he joins me now to discuss these developments. Gordon, as always, so appreciate your time and your expertise on this. Just starting with the latest remarks from China's mouthpieces today, saying that, obviously they very much disagree with this new agreement between Australia, the United States, and the UK, and they've really seized upon some of the divisions between France and our countries as well to try to, I guess, push that divide further. But the interesting language, they were saying if Australia wants to have nuclear propulsion subs, that just might attract other countries to use their nukes on Australia. That I know that they're saber rattling, but I don't think China's in a position to actually really do anything to Australia at this point. They really need that iron ore, don't they? There's a relationship that they actually need there.
Yes, they do need Australia's minerals, but they also do have the missiles that could reach Australia. And you've got to remember that Australia having nuclear propulsion subs is very different than having nuclear weapons. They're not the same. China tells us it has a no first use policy, that it will not be the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. But really what they've said to Australia, which doesn't have nukes, is they're willing to use them first. They also did the same thing to Japan about 6 weeks ago. So clearly we've got a very belligerent Chinese regime that is willing to escalate quickly.
What do you make of this new agreement between the United States and UK and Australia? Because I think to an extent, even though the missile capability is very concerning, but if China could have brought Australia to heel already, I think they would have. Australia, of course, from everything that we know about it, they don't rely upon the imports from China the way that other countries do. So that gives them a little bit more of an advantage. But in looking at this, what do you see being accomplished here? And realistically, I know that we're still in the discussion, beginning stages. What do you anticipate the timeline on something like this being?
Well, the timeline for the subs, which is the core of this agreement, could very well be 15 to 20 years. And that's a very long period. But what this really signals to Beijing is deterrence, that Australia and, specifically the UK as well, which is not in the region, believe that China is an adversary that needs to be deterred. So that's a really good thing. Also, with Australia having, diesel subs, it means basically they're only protecting their shoreline. But if they have, for instance, subs like we do, nuclear propelled, it also means that Australia is willing to patrol the South China Sea, East China Sea, waters close to Beijing. That's a really good thing. And that's a message that the Chinese just abhor.
Were there any countries that you thought should have been brought into this? I mean, we have Five Eyes, which is intelligence sharing. We have the Quad. This is a little different in that we're sharing technology with Australia that we've only previously shared with the UK, and it's a little bit more military capability sharing. But are we missing something? Because I get that it's a start, but it feels like, what about India? What about some of these other countries?
Yeah, India really was not prepared to enter into a security pact of this type right now. India is part of the Quad, which is a good thing. The Quad is the US, Australia, Japan, and India. And that is being operationalized. But I don't think they were willing to move that close to the United States and our partners. Your question is a great one because the issue here is going to be Japan. Japan is very concerned about what's going on. And I think Taiwan, because Taiwan is the target of Chinese belligerent moves. The thing about this agreement, the way it was put together, the strategic vision was correct and a really good thing. But the way that it was put together, the execution was terrible because the United States could have worked with France to try to mitigate some of the friction. I mean, this is extraordinary where France, our oldest ally, is actually took away their ambassador, withdrew their ambassador. So this is important because, Joe Biden ran for president saying he was going to work with allies. He was going to contain China. He could do this much better than President Trump. Well, it looks like President Trump had better relations with France than Biden does.
Now, that's a great point as well, because I remember every time there was a summit, they would always use certain photos to make it look like they were all kind of lecturing or being very I mean, the optics were amazing that they used this. You bring up Japan, Gordon, very, very important ally, very, very important country in all of this. Because I was curious as to why perhaps they wouldn't be involved in something like this. I know that it was about sharing technology with English-speaking countries, but with but including Japan as well into something this operational and the plans for it to be that operational in X amount of time, would that have been too, would China have viewed that as being so aggressive that actually could have proved to be a threat for Japan's national security, do you think?
Well, China's made it very clear that, if Japan were to come to the aid of Taiwan, that the Chinese would nuke Japan. I think that there probably was that concern that you mentioned. But the thing about Japan is that they've got great diesel submarines, perhaps the best in the world, the Soyuz class. And so they really didn't want the submarines that we're offering. And I suspect that because that's the most important and the first item on the agenda for AUKUS, that Japan probably felt it wasn't quite in their interest. But there are other aspects to AUKUS that would be, for instance, AI sharing, cyber defenses, all the rest. And eventually, I think Japan will come in as they will sort of believe that it's more important to defend themselves than to worry about what the Chinese may think.
And speaking of caring about what the Chinese think, I read that Malaysia had reached out to China to get an influenced position on what perspective they should have about this pact. And obviously, I would imagine that Malaysia is going to fall in line wherever China tells them to.
Yes, but of course, China and Malaysia's claims in the South China Sea overlap. And so Malaysia, although it has traditionally been very close to Beijing, has been wary. And that's also been true for the other claimants in the South China Sea. So, Malaysia will sort of sit on the sidelines for as long as it can. And for us, I suppose that's okay. What we really need to do is work with the Vietnams of the world, because Vietnam believes that it has an interest which is very adverse to China's, And also Vietnam is a strong military power. It's been working very close with our friends India and Japan, as well as now Taiwan. So I think that this is a movement in the right direction.
That's very good news as well, because Taiwan, China definitely, I mean, obviously we know, has eyes on Taiwan. I mean, this was what the whole, when the new Top Gun movie was coming out, they had to remove Taiwan, the patch from that jacket, in order to keep 10 cents production dollars in there, which was insane. And I think that's when people realized, this is how, well, a lot of people at least, who maybe didn't follow foreign policies closely, were thinking this is actually how bad it is. We're removing flags from jackets in movies. But to that point, their perspective on Taiwan, if we know that Taiwan would fight, but if China decided to make a move, that ultimately, because so many people's interests would be affected, do you see the Japan and Vietnam and India and the others coming to aid of Taiwan?
I think Japan very well could, because we saw statements from Prime Minister Suga talking about Taiwan being integral to Japan's defense. And Suga will step down sometime either this month or next month, but whoever follows him is probably going to be even stronger on Taiwan. And as China becomes more belligerent, it's actually pushing Taipei and Tokyo together. I don't see Vietnam, I don't see India coming directly to Taiwan's defense, but I do believe that they will help. They can share intelligence, they can do all sorts of things, they can make life difficult for Beijing because they do share borders with China, and actually we have Chinese troops in Indian-controlled territory right now. So life's not going to be too good for Beijing, but nonetheless, this is going to be the defining conflict if China actually moves against Taiwan.
Talking with Gordon Chang. Gordon, I have two more quick questions for you, and I appreciate your expertise on this. I was reading Hong Kong now, their elections. They're having elections. They had their Patriot event where Beijing was basically selecting who was going to run. I think that pretty much is it for the free Hong Kong after this, because now all the elections are entirely controlled by Beijing, CCP-friendly candidates. There's what can people there, what can Hong Kongers really do in resistance to that?
Well, you know, Dana, in Hong Kong, there's been an insurgency. And we know from the history of insurgencies that they often melt away and go away for years and look like they no longer exist, but they do come back. And we've seen that pattern actually in Hong Kong with their big demonstrations, 2003, and then they disappear for a very long time, come back. Yes, Beijing is controlling Hong Kong right now, but, you know, we have actually seen in the early years of the People's Republic, people do fight back. And that could very well occur in Hong Kong. What we really need to see, Dana, is the Biden administration start to step up its support for Hong Kong. They've been absolutely missing on that. And that is really to Biden's shame, because he ran on a platform of helping Hong Kong during the campaign. Yeah.
Last quick question for you, Gordon Chang. This is a little different, but it has to do with Mark Milley being able to call his counterpart in the People's Liberation Army, the communist Chinese military. How unusual was that? Because that was the thing that stuck out to me, the fact that we could have someone like Mark Milley just to bring up his counterpart within the CCP's military. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, it certainly wasn't routine as Milley tried to make it appear, and as he put out on his statement. The thing about this is that it's really, really unusual, especially if the words were as Woodward reported them. You know, if Milley thought that Trump's state of mind made him unfit to be commander-in-chief, there's a constitutional procedure for Milley to follow. He didn't follow it, really. So this was usurping power. And from the Chinese point of view, it reinforced their notion that the U.S. was in political disarray, which means the Chinese are going to be even more arrogant and belligerent going forward. So Milley undermined the security of the United States in a direct and tangible way.
Yeah, very much so, no matter how he tries to spin it. Gordon Chang, as always, so appreciate your expertise on this. Thank you so much for joining us. Good to see you.
Thank you, Dana.
Coming up, folks, what is Congress doing to address this disaster at the southern border? Congressman Tony Gonzales, here from Texas, joins me next to discuss. Black Rifle Coffee Company is a veteran-owned coffee company serving premium coffee to people who love America. And they develop their explosive roast profiles with the same mission focus that they've learned while serving our great nation. And with every purchase you make, Black Rifle Coffee gives back. So in 2020 alone, they donated over 6 million cups of coffee to veteran, law enforcement, and first responder causes. Their high-quality coffee beans are imported all the way from Colombia and Brazil and then carefully roasted at their facilities in Tennessee and Utah. They even have a signature roast called Lava Panther that's directly sourced from a small farm in Guatemala. So although temperatures are somewhat cooling off, it's a breezy 80 degrees here. Don't forget to keep enjoying the great outdoors, fueled by Black Rifle Coffee. The best way to do it is with the Black Rifle Coffee Club. When you join, your chosen brews roasted, packaged, and shipped free right to your door. And you can get special discounts, gain access to exclusive products, and so much more. So purchase at blackriflecoffee.com/Dana. Use code Dana at checkout for 20% off your purchase and your first coffee club order. The influx of migrants and illegal entrants has completely overwhelmed law enforcement, Border Patrol as well. And in an effort to restore this order, the Bipartisan Border Solutions Act was introduced, and it's still awaiting next steps. In the meantime, one of the authors of that bill, Texas Congressman Tony Gonzales, has been on the front lines watching the surge in Del Rio, and he joins me now to discuss what he's seen. Thank you so much for being here, Congressman. Really appreciate your time on this, because now finally, it seems like it's too little too late, but the nation's eyes are finally on the southern border and watching what Border Patrol and what communities there have been putting up with, really honestly for years, but especially so in the past 6 months. What have you seen down there? I mean, because I hear that we hear phrases like irregular migration, which sounds like a digestive issue and not so much, like a problem at the border. But I mean, it looks like, when you look at some of the drone shots, it looks like a festival, thousands strong. I mean, you could tell me that here's on the outskirts of Lollapalooza, and I think I might believe you. What have you been seeing?
Yeah, Dana. No, thanks for having me on. I represent 42% of the southern border. Del Rio is in my district. I'm literally on the border every single week, and I can tell you this week has been tough for many of us. It's as bad as I've ever seen it. I visited Del Rio late last week, and when I walked through that camp, the odor, it's just heartbreaking. Small children running around. You've got a lot of single family adults. The faces of the agents are just tired. They're just worn out. And after I got done with that visit, I looked over at the Border Patrol Sector Chief Garcia, and I told him, I was like, man, I just feel sad. And it's hard to put into emotions, but it's just a terrible situation all the way around. We saw this coming a mile away. The Bipartisan Border Solutions Act that you brought up, we dropped that piece of legislation back in April. And just now, the administration is starting to do some of the things that we called for in that piece of legislation, like adding more ICE agents to the equation. But more has to be done.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're hearing as well, because there's such an overflow, normally when people are illegally entering, and at least in the past decade, more often than not, and particularly if there's a Democrat who's in the White House, the policy's been, okay, we'll just give them a date, they'll go see an immigration judge, and then release them into the interior, and then they'll come back and maybe have that court date, which usually they don't. But one of the things that I was hearing is from Bill Melugin, who's been down there, as you know, was that it's not so much a court date, but just a request to appear, which takes, as opposed to an hour to fill that out, it's like 20 minutes. So really, most of these people, especially those who are wanting to file and receive asylum, they're actually not going to really be able to go in front of a judge and make that case and see if that's going to be granted, correct?
No, that's exactly right. And, this catch and release is the most dangerous aspect to the immigration system, because what it does is it highlights that the border is wide open. You can say all day long that it's closed, but your actions speak louder than your words. And when you get released to your final destination, which most of these folks are Haitians, most of these folks are headed to South Florida to relocate. When that happens, there's an echo chamber. They go back to their friends and family, and they let everybody know that the border is wide open. One of the things also in our bill, my bill is with Senator Cornyn, a Republican from Texas, Senator Sinema, a Democrat from Arizona, and Congressman Henry Cuellar, a good friend of mine, Democrat from Laredo. One of the things that it calls for is to add immigration judges to the equation. People should have their day in court, not 2 years from now, but 2 days. And if they do not qualify for asylum, they need to be returned to their country of origin. That's the only way that this ultimately slows down and gets better.
You mentioned so many, especially this time around, which I don't think that we've ever seen so many Haitian refugees coming over. And Daily Mail had independently reported that a significant number of the Haitian refugees coming forward had been granted asylum in Chile. And they had photo IDs, like they had already been granted asylum. Some of them had been there anywhere from 5 to 10 years, working in Santiago. They were coming and leaving their identity, their photo identification cards from Chile right there at the border. What do you know of those numbers?
Yeah, about 85% of the folks that are coming seeking asylum they're Haitian, but they're not coming from Haiti. They're coming from Central and South America, just like you mentioned. Many of them have been living there for years, sometimes decades, and essentially they were adapting to our system. And they would shed their documentation. They would come over and they would say what they needed to say in order to come through. It's a very organized system, all led by the cartels, all led by these criminal organizations that are exploiting our very laws and making this process even more efficient. Now Haitians coming through Del Rio isn't new for us. These numbers are what has kind of brought so much attention to them. But Haitians have been traveling through Del Rio for months on end. It's just that the cartels have become so efficient at it. They're busing people directly to the source or oftentimes flying them in as well. But this only gets under control when the Biden administration re-implements Remain in Mexico and enforces Title 42 policy.
And I think it's so important to point out as well how much of a bipartisan issue really ultimately this has become. I mean, you're mentioning, Henry Cuellar and Kristen Sinema, also there in DC with you, and Republicans and Democrats working on this and trying to get the administration to realize the significance and just how dangerous this is for, not just and I really feel for the children that are being drugged through, because they're at the will of the adults that are dragging them through, but for all of our communities that are there at the border. I mean, the resources and the safety and security of ranchers and people in some of these smaller towns. What do you think now that, it really is a bipartisan venture? What do you think that the chances are? You say you proposed it back in April and that now it's starting to get some movement. Is that, are they finally starting to understand really what's happening and because of it's a bipartisan effort and there are more Democrats that are speaking to this?
Yeah, what I've seen with the administration is they will only do something when there's enough political pressure that forces them to do something. And in this case, there is so much pressure on what's happening in Del Rio. They're forced to act. That's why they added so many ICE agents to the equation. Another part of the bill that we have, the Bipartisan Border Solutions Act, is to track these minors that have been in custody, because the last thing that we want, that anyone should want, is any harm coming to children, innocent children, regardless of their legal status. And what we've seen just in the past few days is we've seen 33 allegations of sexual conduct in these HHS facilities, these DHS overseeing these migrant facilities. That is a problem. That is something that needs to be investigated and looked at. This bill tackles that. It also tackles that what happens to these children once they're released. What I don't want to see happen is a generation of children that are forgotten because ultimately they're innocent. That makes it a bipartisan issue.
Yeah, so much, and that's the administration's idea of compassion, to have people put through this. It's awful. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me. I'm happy that you're doing this, and we'll keep our eyes on the progress of this bipartisan effort too. Thank you so much. Good to see you.
Thank you, Dana.
So coming up, Senator Rand Paul joined me earlier today on my radio program to discuss the latest on vaccine mandates, natural immunity, boosters. We even talked about FISA warrants. We got that for you coming up next. So earlier today, I spoke with Senator Rand Paul on my radio program, and we discussed natural immunity, vaccine mandates, and genetic sequencing. I learned a lot from this interview. I think more so than I've ever had with any CDC official talking to Dr. Fauci. Here's our discussion. Look, if people want to get vaccinated, that's their choice. But mandating something, it just seems to me that if the government, Senator, is going to mandate that you get an injection, that injection ought to do what they claim that it will do. And so far from the CDC, we haven't seen that. Your thoughts?
Well, this gets to my point. Every individual is different, age groups are different, and your risks you evaluate individually. And in a free country, you make your decisions based on what you perceive your risk to be. So if you're over 65, 90% of those over 65 have decided voluntarily that they think the risks of the disease are much greater than any possible problem with the vaccine, and 90% of people voluntarily took the vaccine. Over age 50, 75% of people over 50 have taken it. But it's also different if you're under 15. If you're under 25, the death rate is about 1 in a million. So why would we want to mandate it to people where the death rate is very low? Why would we want to mandate it to people who've already had the disease? Studies out of Israel now show that if you've gotten the disease naturally, if you've been unlucky but you've gotten it and you've survived, that your immunity actually is equal to or exceeds the vaccine. One study said 27 times better. And that's not an argument against the vaccine. It's just an argument that we should count these people in our statistics. Because if you don't count 100 million Americans who got it naturally, then you're like Dr. Fauci and wringing your hands and saying, oh my, we must force inoculation. We must force vaccine on children because not enough people have been vaccinated. The truth is we were very close to controlling this. In May, June, when we got down to less than 10,000 cases, we were almost there. And then the virus eluded or evolved around the vaccine, and it's able to penetrate the defenses of the vaccine. So it's not only the lack of vaccination, unvaccinated is part of it, but it's also that the vaccine has eluded us. So the real answer right now is probably allowing a new vaccine to come forward. Instead, they're wanting to sell you last year's news, the old vaccine as a booster, but it doesn't really affect the Delta variant as well as the new one will. So just like with the flu, we get a new vaccine each year, there is a Delta vaccine out there. And what they should do, instead of trying to mandate that your newborn get a shot before they leave the hospital of a vaccine that's now a year old, they should be following Trump's predicate and doing an actual Operation Warp Speed for a new vaccine, a new Delta variant. It's already made. We just have to get it through the red tape now.
That's a great point. We're talking with Senator Rand Paul because, I play a scientist and a medical researcher on air. So I'm looking at this and just hearing from some of your line of questioning with Fauci previously and hearing some of these other medical experts. I mean, you're an actual doctor, so you kind of know a little bit about this. I don't understand how they could claim that one vaccine could apply to another mutation when there hasn't been any of the genome sequencing. They haven't been able to do anything that actually directs it towards that mutation.
Well, there's partial overlap. So what I would say is the vaccine is still of value. If you're over 65, I recommend that people get vaccinated voluntarily. Right. I'm not mandating anybody, but my suggestion, if you're over 65, I would be vaccinated, even though it's imperfect. Because let's say you get some immune response, means you can still be infected, but you have some pre-existing immune response, even if it's partial. It's better than not having any. The problem is we also don't know who this affects. There's random people that probably have some genetic predisposition to having an overly exuberant immune response and their lungs become filled with fluid. We don't yet know who those people are. There are more of them over 65 than under. But one of the things we could do, and that I've been promoting, not that Dr. Fauci will listen, is we need to find a group of people that don't usually die, but unfortunately have died from this. Let's say under age 40, find 100 people who died from COVID, and then under age 40, find the people who had no symptoms. Genetically sequence all of those people and say, could we find a genetic sequence that helps us find the unusual person that's got some kind of genetic predisposition? There is going to be an anomaly that could be found. We have the ability to go through your entire genome in a day. We can take a DNA sample of your cells in your body, and we can go through the whole sequence in a day. So it's automated, and the machines can do this for us. So we could really, in a relatively short time, compare and try to find what is the anomaly that allows somebody to have no symptoms and somebody else to die from this disease.
That's been part of the questions that we have been throwing back and forth here. Like, what are the is there genetic predisposition that makes someone react in a certain way? And that's a great point that you just had. A quick question for you on this. Why is there no importance placed on natural immunity? Why is that treated as though it's either non-existent or it is somehow inferior to that antibodies produced by vaccines?
Dr. Fauci's dissembling, but he's lying to you for the greater good. So he believes that he's, Plato's reincarnation and that the masses aren't smart enough to make a decision on being vaccinated. He really wants you to be vaccinated. And by and large, the advice to be vaccinated is good. But he's afraid if he tells you that natural immunity works, that you might not be vaccinated if you've already gotten it. He knows that you're protected. But what he's doing is he's thinking, what's the simplest way to get the beehive, the collective, entirely vaccinated? Let's don't let them think about it. Let's don't let them noodle through how to take it. Because some, like Dr. McCary, who have made some good points of advice, he says, well, you probably don't need it, but if you're going to take it, maybe one dose. And Dr. Fauci is aghast. He's like, oh, no, we don't want anybody thinking about this. Just do what you're told. So blind submission is what this is about. It isn't about science. Because the interesting part of the science is that, yes, natural infection does provide, once you've had COVID, a great deal of immunity, at least as much as the vaccine. For a year, they came to me. Every reporter in the halls of Congress came to me and said, well, you don't know how long it'll last. And I would look at them and say, yeah, but you don't know how long the vaccine will last either. It's like, I'm not condemning the vaccine. I actually think it works. Why are condemning nature's vaccine, which I got, and saying it doesn't work when I'm not saying that the vaccine is going to run out and we won't know till over time? And I've also told people I'm not adamantly opposed. I've not been vaccinated yet, but over the next couple of months, if the Delta variant starts killing people like me who have been infected and it looks like I need to be vaccinated, I probably will, but I'll probably try to get the Delta vaccine because I've already been inoculated to the wild variant. My susceptibility, if I have any, is probably to the Delta variant. Why would I want to take the old vaccine when I think the new one is what I need and what most elderly people are going to need is a booster of the new vaccine? So really what we should be doing is, it's exactly the same technology. I don't know how the flu vaccine gets approved so quickly. How do we get a flu vaccine every year? And they're saying, oh, it's going to take another year to get a Delta vaccine. By then we may be on to Mu or Rho or some other Greek letter. So, I think we should be talking about this, and not enough people are talking about where's the Delta vaccine and what's it going to take to let the government allow it to be approved sooner.
You can watch the full interview with Senator Rand Paul on my YouTube page or on official Dana Lash on Facebook. That does it for us tonight. Thanks for tuning in. Good night, and don't bend the knee.